Okay, so why don't we start since it's 2:02 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So hi everyone, it's wonderful to see you virtually. I wish this was in person, but Professor Guenther and I were just saying that it's actually great that it's virtual because it provides an opportunity for more people to actually participate in this really wonderful event. So it's, again, wonderful to see all of you. My name is Crystal Mudhed-Peck, and I'm an associate professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies, or GSST, at UC Riverside. But I'm calling from my home, from the ancestral land of the Tongva people, otherwise known as Los Angeles, and specifically San Gabriel Valley. So I want to really welcome all of you to the first of 3 events that we'll be actually co-hosting this year, and we being the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies, and also the Center for Ideas in Society, or CIS, as part of a book salon series this academic year. And I really want to thank CIS so much just for the organization and the support. It's been so wonderful to work with them. So this book salon series will actually feature recently published or to be published books that are also very timely by GSST faculty. And as part of sort of these book salon events, each GSST faculty member will actually be in conversation with an interlocutor of their choice about their books, and we'll also have a conversation, a Q&A with our audience, all of you today. And as part of this series, we're offering a significant discount from 20 to 30% off from, for the authors' books from their respective presses. And if you register, you should actually receive that discount code, and it's good before or after the talk. And just let me know if you have any questions during the Q&A. So I do want to segue into the conversation portion, but before I do that, just a few more items. I want to introduce you first to our wonderful participants today. So we have Professor Katja M. Guenther, who is a wonderful colleague and also Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. Her research and teaching focus on gender, social movements, human-animal relationships in the state, all from a feminist perspective. She is the author of Making Their Place, Feminism After Socialism in Eastern Germany, as well as the critical book that we'll be discussing today, The Life and Death of Shelter Animals, published earlier this year by Stanford University Press. And we also have Carol J. Adams here with us. And we're so fortunate, Carol, to have you. And I'm just, again, so sorry that we couldn't host you in person at UC Riverside. So Carol is a feminist scholar, as well as an activist whose written work explores the cultural construction of overlapping, as well as interconnected oppressions, as well as the ethics of care. Carol's first book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, is now celebrating its 30th anniversary, which is amazing. She's also the author of Berger and Bloomsbury's Optic Lesson series, as well as a co-author with Virginia Messina of Protest Kitchen, Fight Injustice, Save the Planet, and Fuel Your Resistance One Meal at a Time, and many other books. Also, a new and updated The Pornography of Meat, which was originally published in 2004, will appear this fall, 2020. And there's also a visual accompaniment to The Sexual Politics of Meat, which will include 340 images sent from around the world by Adams' readers, whom she calls grassroots sociologists. She's also working on a memoir of her mother based on her essay from the New York Times, Finding Myself in My Mother's Calendars. So again, so honored to have you here, Carol. Just as a really brief agenda, what we'll do is we'll segue into about a 45 minute conversation, although keeping it flexible between Carol and Professor Guenther, and then we'll transition into a Q&A with our authors, and then transition to a closing. And then lastly, I just want to remind, I know we're all probably very fluent with Zoom now, but just as a few quick reminders, please do keep your mics off during the conversation portion, and during the Q&A, you can use a chat box to ask your questions. And if it's possible or accessible, please do use a stack function, so Catherine from CIS and I can keep track of your questions. And then again, just to keep the flow of the conversation between our speakers today, I would request that you don't types of questions during their conversation portion. Although if you feel really moved to, you just have to comment, you can do that, but we'll actually sort of segue into that after their talk. So that's a lot of talking from me. So I want to give it to Professor Guenther and Carol.
Thank you, Crystal, for all you've done and in organizing this. And Katja, congratulations on this book. What a lot of work, and I feel honored to be the person who's your interlocutor. I wondered if we could start by, if you could identify the issues you see as operating in the shelter after all the work you did there.
Absolutely. So as those who are here who've had a chance to read the book already know, and for those of you who don't know, I'll give you a little bit of background about the book in that it presents an analysis of a high intake public shelter that I call the Pacific Animal Welfare Center, or PAW, which is located right here in the Southern California area. It's a shelter that perhaps some of you have, unbeknownst to you, been to as well. When I started my field work, that shelter received about 20,000 live animals each year. The vast majority of those animals are cats and dogs, but they also get every kind of domesticated and exotic animal you can imagine, from pigs and horses to iguanas, parrots, parakeets, bearded dragons, and you name it. From the shelter's perspective, so from the perspective of shelter management, the core issues at the shelter center on maintaining public health and safety first, and secondly, providing what they see as humane care to animals who are impounded at the shelter during the time that they're waiting, hopefully to be adopted, but in many cases ending up being what the shelter calls humanely euthanized, or what I more accurately refer to as killing in the book. In my analysis of the shelter, I find that these elements of PAW's core mission obscure far more complex issues that are really going on at the shelter that fall into two overlapping groups. There's sort of issues pertaining to inequalities and issues of resistance. And inequalities and resistance are really tied up in absolutely everything that happens and how people experience and how animals experience the shelter itself. Animal shelters are complex social institutions where people and animals are engaged in near constant negotiations about who is deserving of being a guardian to a companion animal, which animals should be made available to adopt and which should be fast-tracked into the killing mode, which animals should be seen as sort of representative of good animals in the shelter, who gets to make the various decisions about the fates of both people and animals and with what justifications, and from the perspective of impounded animals themselves, which humans and human actions to resist and which to acquiesce to and when. I write in the book that what happens at PAW is really the outcome of routine and sustained collisions of capitalism, of patriarchy, of white supremacy, and of anthroparchy. And anthroparchy, for those of you not familiar with the term, refers to humans' domination of non-human animals and everything that's part of what we define as the natural world. So PAW is really a social world in which our society's commitment to devaluing the lives of both poor and non-white people and also of animals means that relationships between members of the predominantly poor and non-white community that PAW so-called serves, and then also the companion animals to whom they are guardians, are very frequently interrupted. And what I really saw as a key issue in the shelter are the many ways in which precarity and poverty collide and create conditions that contribute to animals being there and contribute to people's relationships with animals in their care being severed. The race, class, and gender of the animals and their guardians render some shelter animals' lives as being more worth saving, and also as being more grievable, and classify other animal lives as being less grievable and as being more disposable. Specifically, society at large and the shelter community value animals who are associated with femininity and connected to white middle-class people, and those that have low status in the shelter and who are much more likely to be killed in the shelter are those animals who are presumed to have had guardians who are lower income people, or whose future guardians also are imagined to be lower income people, especially people of color and Black and Latinx men, even more specifically. So those are some of the initial complexities of what is happening. What I also observed in the shelter was that there was a great deal of struggle between volunteers and animal rescuers on the one hand, and shelter staff on the other, generally involving women struggling against a masculinist bureaucracy that doesn't have a lot of respect or concern for animal life. Overwhelmingly, the volunteers at the shelter, like myself, I'm a pretty typical demographic example of who volunteers there, and animal rescuers are white women with higher levels of education. They have middle or upper class status. And a lot of them are in the so-called creative classes where they have a lot of flexibility in their own employment situations to sort of come and go from the shelter at will during the week and also on weekends. And that's a big contrast to the staff, who are overwhelmingly almost 100% working class people who have high school degrees as their highest level of education, in some cases associates, but not that many, and almost all of whom were Latinx, or a few who were Black, almost none who were white. Volunteers in this environment routinely resist the shelter's treatment of animals, and especially the killing of animals. And this regularly places volunteers in direct conflict with the staff members. Those conflicts at face value might just seem like negotiations between two people, a staff member and a volunteer, about the fate and the care being given to a particular animal. But they're really conflicts that involve racial, ethnic, and class-based resentments, that involve the assertion of white power, of white knowledge as superior, and also the continued violation of animals' bodily autonomy. Another big issue in the shelter are the experiences of animals themselves, and I would be remiss not to mention that as well, and particularly the animals' resistance to the conditions of their own confinement. The control of animal resistance is really central to how the shelter is organized, and trying to control animal resistance is a key part of the shelter's activities. So both the entire physical space, but also the logic of the interactions that staff engage in with the animals, and what volunteers are also encouraged to do by staff, is really about regulating, surveilling, and controlling animal bodies. How animals experience shelters has been really absent from the literature on animal shelters in general. And that's actually a pretty voluminous body of literature, but most of it comes from veterinary science and animal behavior. It tends to focus on a pretty narrow set of questions that are very shelter specific, like, do Black animals have a lower chance of being adopted than white ones, kind of questions. So a very different kind of analysis than what I was, undertaking. So for me, it was really, really important in working on this project to investigate PAW specifically as a social space, with attention to the two largest populations there, which are those of dogs and also of cats. And that's really how animal resistance came to the forefront of my analysis. I dedicate one chapter to elaborating how shelter animals are in fact agentic actors with their own desires and capacity for resistance to the carceral anthroparchal power of the shelter, and to whom the shelter often responds, most often, unfortunately, by pathologizing what they consider the behavior of resistant animals, and then killing animals who engage in resistance. One other issue that I wanted to mention about the sort of broader issues of the animal shelter is also just the issue of the ethics of animal sheltering more generally. And just thinking about this right now, I don't think I even use the word ethics in the book, maybe a single time. So this is not a book that is about ethics per se, but there's a broader context of PAW that's this backdrop of a shelter industry that has been going through significant changes over the last 15-ish years, really taking off mostly in the last decade, in which the kinds of ethical claims that shelters are making differ very much from what they were in the past. And specifically, we're seeing more and more that shelters, including big public shelters like PAW, are claiming ethically that they're moving towards trying to reduce the killing of companion animals. So even shelters that aren't aspiring to reach so-called no-kill status, which is itself a misnomer we can talk about later in the Q&A if anyone is interested, there's still a move towards making the appearance that public shelters are places that treat animals well, where animals are properly cared for, and where they're given a proper chance at being adopted. More recently, there have also been some nonprofit animal welfare groups and even some public shelters who are doing different kinds of extension of services into the communities they serve. So not just waiting for people to come to them, but actually going out into the community and trying to provide material resources that would facilitate animals and their guardians staying together and being able to overcome whatever kind of problems in the past might have brought those animals into the shelter. Still, I would say that those kind of new ethical efforts remain a minority, and in most cases are really band-aid approaches in that they don't address the underlying problems that keep companion animals flowing into the shelter, especially in lower income communities, both in Los Angeles, but really around the country. When we look at the shelters that have the highest numbers of intakes, they're overwhelmingly shelters that are taking a lot of animals, particularly from poor communities of color. So I guess sort of the final issue is more argumentative, that, you know, if the United States wants to become a low kill nation, or even a no kill nation, or at least one where we can maybe start thinking about ourselves as being a humane nation, animal advocates around companion animal issues really need to adopt a broader social justice lens in their advocacy for humans and animals involved in shelter systems. So at the conclusion of the book, I spell out some ideas for that, introducing the idea of a humane communities approach, which specifically works to counter anthroparchy, poverty, and targeted incarceration as some of the main reasons that we see animals in shelters and why so many of them continue to die there.
It's also powerful, innovative in the way that you take a shelter and sort of undo the origami of it and show us its workings and its implications on so many levels. So I'm wondering if you've had responses by the rescue and sheltering world to your book and your ideas. Are people welcoming, upset? Is the secret now out? How have you been received?
Yeah, so for me, this has been kind of the most surprising and exciting aspect of the book coming out. So far, the response that I've been getting has been overwhelmingly positive. I've heard from shelter directors and shelter staff members from across the country, from people right here in Southern California to Baltimore to Detroit to Chicago to New York. So like some of the biggest shelter systems in our country, telling me, you know, via unsolicited emails and messages via social media, how much the book has resonated with them and how powerful and important they think it is that someone is finally telling what one of them called exactly the words that you just used, the big secret about animal sheltering in the United States. So that's been genuinely a moving experience for me. It's really the best possible scenario for an author who's hoping that their work is going to have an actual real life impact. And I have to be honest and say that I was braced for very negative reactions from the shelter workers, but also from members of the rescue community in particular. I'd really anticipated that my analyses showing how the whole idea of irresponsible owners is actually the outcome of racist, classist, and sexist ideas, and some of my arguments in the book as well about how animal rescuers, those are people who come to the shelter and take dogs who are at high likelihood for being killed, and they take them into their own care usually through nonprofit organizations, and then rehome them themselves outside of the shelter. I talk about how they really engage in practices of maintaining whiteness through how they position pit bulls. So I really thought those parts of the book especially, you know, might rub you know, animal rescuers and some shelter workers in the wrong, you know, in a particular direction. So far, those criticisms haven't materialized. The book's only been out for not even 2 months. So it's possible that those are still coming and I haven't heard them yet. I also haven't heard anything at this time from anybody who is a current or former staff person at PAW itself, even though I know several such people, including one of the key managers who was a manager during the time when I was conducting field work, have purchased the book. So I don't know if they haven't read it yet. Or, you know, if commentary is still going to be forthcoming. But I think a couple things happened just in the time since the book went into production, you know, it takes almost a year for a book to work its way through the production process, you know, or 9 or 10 months in most academic presses. And I think that there's sort of two sets of events that really shifted how people are thinking and responding to the text now, particularly in regards to my analyses of racism and about policing. One of those shifts is the outcome from the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement's response to that murder in particular, which I think really drove anti-Blackness into white consciousness in a way that so many of the previous police killings of Black people in the United States didn't. And I think part of that, you know, as a lot of pop culture pundits are talking about as well, is just the power of video. Right, and the particular degree of depravity and disregard shown for the life of George Floyd in the video of his murder, but also the repetition of anti-Black violence being caught on camera, you know, at these really regular, tragically regular intervals, and then the depth and the rage of sorrow and anguish that the protesters showed, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And I think that in the rescue community, which I said is overwhelmingly white, somewhat Asian American, and very little Latinx or African American, that people are starting to engage a little bit differently and think about how they themselves are involved or implicated in reproducing racial inequalities. And I think some of that probably is performative rather than actual, you know, deep introspection, but it is shifting how people are talking about sheltering. And I think it's kind of opened up a different space for people to listen to some of the arguments that I make in this book, instead of just shutting them down from the outset as kind of an attack on whiteness, which is how I was concerned, you know, it could be read in some corners. And I think another big shift that happened, especially since March with the COVID pandemic, but also related to these issues of race in the United States that I was just talking about. You know, in the book, I show how PAW is really a carceral institution and how it shares so many core practices and logics with prisons. And if you walk through most animal shelters, it's pretty hard to see it as anything other than, at face value, a prison for animals, if you will. And I argue we need to think, you know, rethink caging as an approach for managing either animals or people. And that idea of care, not caging, was already in circulation, you know, well before I wrote the book, but primarily in regards to talking about humans and human incarceration. But now there's an idea taking hold in the actual sheltering industry itself that we need to move away from caging as our way of organizing animal shelters and the animal welfare industry. And a huge part of that is because of how many people came out at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to foster and adopt animals. Animal shelters across the country are seeing rates of growth in their fostering programs that they could never even have imagined, you know, would happen. Obviously, no one imagined COVID was going to happen either, you know, but when the pandemic started and people were suddenly facing being at home for long periods, it was like the first thing so many people did was go and adopt a cat, go and sign up to rescue or foster for a local shelter. I know in the city of Los Angeles, the number of animals that were in their shelters was more than 40% lower in May of 2020 than it was in May a year prior. And that is a massive drop. We don't see drops like that in the sheltering industry from one year to the next in the number of intakes. Like if there's a 1% or 2%, you know, decrease in the number of animals in the shelter, that's to celebrate. But a 40% drop is just epic. And the LA city shelters actually ended up closing 2 of their 6 facilities altogether because they don't need them. And this rapid growth in fostering programs has really led some industry leaders, for the first time that I'm aware of, to start talking about deinstitutionalizing animal shelters. And even just a few months ago, I really don't think that that was at all sort of a mainstream idea. And now there's a consortium being led by Maddie's Fund, which is one of the major, if not the major funder of animal shelter animal issues and programs in the United States, and American Pets Alive, to deinstitutionalize shelter animals. And their goal is to reduce both the number of shelters in the United States and also the number of animals in shelters in the United States by half within about the next 3 to 5 years. And they've already reached out to me to talk with me about my research, and we're talking about how they can use it in their advocacy work. But I'm still in this state of amazement and wonderful surprise that there are any leaders at all in the sheltering industry talking about deinstitutionalization, because this is, just a concept that most shelter managers, frankly, see their shelters as short-term warehouses for animals, and where caging is what you have to do in order to run a shelter. But now this idea is emerging, wait a minute, we could actually care for the majority of these animals by either doing everything we can to make sure they stay in their family of origin, so they never actually make it into a shelter in the first place, or that they're in foster homes rather than keeping them in cages in shelter environments. So in the last chapters of the book, I presented like this utopian vision. It's just a couple pages long of, what a cage-free vision would look like, where there are no shelters anymore. And honestly, when I wrote it, to me, it seemed like, really far-fetched utopia. And I still think the particular model, because it requires a lot of other structural changes in our society, is probably not going to happen. But just the fact people are talking about it, for me, is huge and really, really exciting as an author.
That's wonderful to feel that you're part of or have anticipated a change and can perhaps help people think that through. I want to go back to the white supremacy aspect of it for a minute, that the animal shelter, in a sense, is enabled to police human-animal relationships, and then targets people of color or low-income people, or that it has that ability to move in and seize and all that sort of control that we associate with law enforcement. And you've touched on the effect of George Floyd's murder and all that, but one of the things I wonder about, having written The Sexual Politics of Meat, is I see white supremacy protecting itself in animal agriculture, because meat eating and consumption of milk and eggs are protected white practices. And some of the most horrific cruelty to animals is happening in industrial agriculture, which is protected or unseen or unprosecuted. For chickens, the Animal Welfare Act does not even recognize they could be harmed. So it's like this double standard is protecting a certain form of consumption while policing relationships. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is, in the kinds of prosecutions for individual harm that's allowed for animal shelter or for animal control workers, is one of its purposes, or does it succeed without it being an explicit purpose, to deflect attention from the incredible harms of institutionalized animal agriculture? So that we even have animal organizations that spend all their time, either posting photos of people, arrested for animal abuse, or working against the dog trade in China or Korea or Cambodia or wherever, when the whole institutional cruelty of animal agriculture gets to be put over here. And how did you experience that, or have reflections for us on that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly that our practices in the United States are highly hypocritical in terms of human relationships with animals, that we have, a lot of different legal and extra legal mechanisms for protecting companion animals from what we see as abuse and neglect. Whereas farmers and transporters and slaughterhouses are legally and culturally themselves protected, right, rather than the animals being protected from so many of the horrific ways that animals in animal agriculture are tortured every moment. I think our society, holds that carceral responses are the appropriate response specifically to violence against companion animals, and that's one of the areas as well where I think we need to see some shift in how animal liberationists and animal welfare advocates as well conceptualize what the appropriate response is to particular acts against animals, i.e. is incarceration or a carceral response really what we want to be pursuing. But there's, in the shelter, what I always observed and in our broader culture as well is just this dominant tendency to see people who abuse companion animals as being deranged and dangerous. And there's also, psychological literature out there on how killing animals is a precursor to escalated violence that then will be committed against humans at a later time. I've never looked for it, but I don't believe that there's research out there like that about working in slaughterhouses or, in routinized animal killing. Certainly during my field work, there were a lot of cases of animal cruelty in the broader Los Angeles area. And without fail, those cases would always cause my email inbox and my social media to just explode with messages from people asking me to show up at hearings, to protest outside of judges' homes, to demand, the harshest possible sentencing for people who had allegedly participated in these crimes, and also to push our legislators here in California to increase the penalties available against folks who were, convicted of committing animal abuse. And, I think as you were suggesting as well, like the comments on social media about people who engage in violence against animals, it's just vitriolic. And even things that are relatively benign, like occasionally I see these videos that show, like from somebody's Ring doorbell, somebody pulling up, in front of a park and leaving their dog behind and driving away. It just creates this moral outrage, right? Who is this monster person? And instantly people are posting on there or tweeting, they should be killed. Someone should take them to the ends of Antarctica and dump them there. Just these really aggressive response. And there is no parallel response for farmed animals other than the small group of animal rights activists. And I think even the videos circulating that show violence against farmed animals overwhelmingly seem to draw the attention of people who are already sympathetic to the causes of animal welfare or who see themselves as animal liberationists.
Well,
yeah,
I was
sorry.
going to segue to, I guess it's a three-part question about feelings. And, you're touching on the feelings of people who feel this outrage, but I'm thinking about, for instance, Ingrid Newkirk, who admits to being misanthropic. And I've always wondered if that began when she worked in an animal shelter and then when she herself was a deputy sheriff who focused on animal cruelty. And she told the New Yorker when they did a piece on her and PETA, in the most unequivocal terms, that the world would be an infinitely better place without humans in it at all. So I'm wondering, here's the three-parter. Misanthropy, did you see it? Did you experience it in the shelter among the workers and volunteers? Is it predictable? Can you help us think about the causes? Did you have feelings of misanthropy during the time you were at the shelter? Or did you find that by having an understanding of structural inequality, as well as the feminist philosophical perspectives on caregiving, that you were able to avoid these feelings or address them early on? And finally, I think I saw Katie Gillespie here. She's another person who's done this kind of very difficult field work where you're experiencing these kinds of emotions, and I know has written on it. But the grief, is in an animal shelter, does the grief just turn and become misanthropic? Or were you, both because of your understanding of structural inequality and the kind of support system you had outside the shelter, able to move through this massive feelings that it must have produced? So sorry.
No, that's great. That's a great question. I'll try to address all three, but I might have to circle back to you for a reminder on one of them. So I'll start by saying, in case I don't know if we have a lot of students on our meeting or not, but for those who aren't familiar with the term, misanthropy refers to a dislike of humans and an avoidance of them. And I certainly did observe a lot of expressions of misanthropic feelings among shelter volunteers and workers, and also among members of the rescue community who came to the shelter to rescue dogs, but with whom I had different types of contact as well outside of the shelter. And I can't say definitively whether those expressions of misanthropy reflected an actual worldview or if they were sort of fleeting moments of misanthropic frustration. But certainly hearing language about hating people was very common. People, volunteers, staff, others would just say, people suck. I can't believe that curse word person, did that. People are such, curse word, a lot of swearing happening as well in the shelter environment, and, directed specifically at people who were leaving animals there. And, you know, I think for the workers, especially the people who are the frontline workers at the shelter, that misanthropy actually comes from a couple of different sources. I think we tend to think of it as like a linear relationship, that a shelter worker, as part of their day-to-day job, is just seeing a lot of people who are abandoning their animals or who are abusing or neglecting animals. And so that leads them to be misanthropic. You know, my analysis of PAW would be that it's, again, something quite a bit more complex than that going on. That misanthropy wasn't really just about witnessing the consequences of human abuse and neglect of animals. In fact, you know, in terms of legal definitions of abuse, there was relatively little of it. At PAW, we had maybe 2 to 3 cases a year, if that, of cases that were actually picked up by the district attorney and prosecuted as, you know, as abuse cases. Neglect, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there's really no legal protections for animals as long as they have food, water, and some access to shade. In California, you can basically do whatever you want with your animals. And those are the people that, you know, became part of this broader group of the population of irresponsible owners who caused so many of the antagonisms between the staff and the volunteers at the shelter and the public that it serves. And certainly I think all of us, whether we were staff or volunteers, you know, have cases that broke our hearts. And I remember, you know, talking with kennel attendants who were weeping over a particular encounter that they had with a human guardian. You know, and those memories, honestly, they could be a whole nother book, because there's so many stories that volunteers and staff have of their interactions. But I think that the discourse of irresponsible owners also ends up being kind of protective from misanthropic feelings, because there's this idea that there's one specific group out there, mostly poor people who are Black and brown and yellow, who lack the moral fitness to be guardians to companion animals. And focusing on them limits the population of people against whom you develop antagonistic or misanthropic feelings. So it's not an idea that all people are bad. It's just this subgroup of irresponsible owners who are the bad, you know, the bad people. And I think for a lot of the staff and the volunteers, you know, that's why the irresponsible ownership, one of the reasons why the irresponsible ownership discourse is kind of productive and protective for them. But I also think there's a lot that happens in the shelter that's not even specifically about interactions with animals' guardians. There's so many challenging aspects of that environment. Just by way of one example, most days there are 2 to 4 women who are staff members who work at the front desk in the lobby, and they spend all day processing adoptions, helping people who are coming in to pay their licensing fees, answering just general questions from the public who don't understand always what exactly the animal shelter is or what it does, helping people who are trying to reclaim their dogs. People come in to pay violations for noise, for fecal matter, for leaving a dead body of an animal, you know, out with their trash when you're not allowed to do that in California, you know, all manner of things. And I spent a lot of time in that lobby. You know, one of the things I noticed very early on in my field work is that while many of those transactions are totally mundane and unremarkable, so many of them also involved really significant verbal aggression and also a tremendous amount of microaggression. And the microaggression generally was perpetrated by the white, well-heeled women who rescue dogs and come from outside of the shelter service area to do that towards the staff. And I also saw a tremendous amount of sexual harassment of the women staff members who worked at the front desk. So when I think even just about like that particular subset of workers, you know, if they had misanthropic feelings, those are not even people who were, you know, in the kennels per se. They didn't even necessarily see the dogs. And some of them I know made a point to not go in there. They would say to me, you know, I don't go in there, Katya, it's just too upsetting. So I just stay out here and I've got enough crap to deal with, you know, on this side of the wall that separated the lobby, you know, from the kennel areas. So those people too were expressing, you know, a lot of misanthropic feelings, and it wasn't even really about animals. Likewise, the climate for workers is really difficult. The environment at PAW, and I think this is true for most public animal shelters, is that lower level workers have virtually no input or authority in their day-to-day work conditions. They're often subjected to very harsh discipline for what to an outsider seem like pretty minor infractions. There are cameras everywhere, and they're constantly being monitored and surveilled in what they are doing. And the structure is really, really hierarchical. And, you know, just spending time there as somebody, as a sociologist who's interested in, you know, organizations, some of the characteristics of that workplace are extremely high levels of cliquishness among the staff, a ton of power plays, an immense amount of resentment about who gets promoted and who kind of stagnates on the career ladder. You know, and I think as sort of a general summary, these are truly toxic workplaces for people to be in. And so some of those feelings of misanthropy aren't even about the animals that are coming in and their relationships with humans, but rather just about what's happening, you know, in the shelter itself. You'd also asked me.
Right, you're missing. Did you
yeah,
feel?
if I felt it. Yeah, and that's, you know, I would say there may be some people on the call who know me well enough to know that probably a lot of people who know me would say I was misanthropic before I started this research. But, you know, the research, I certainly entered it already with a strong worldview that humans have wreaked havoc on our planet and largely on each other. You know, we've done far more harm than we have done good. But I also tend to hold out generally because I'm kind of an optimistic person that, you know, that we can do better. I did have sometimes feelings I would describe as misanthropic at the shelter, but they weren't feelings that to me ever really translated into a change of worldview. In the book, for example, I tell the story of a dog named Fats, P-H-A-T-Z, who was a middle-aged pit bull who came into the shelter. And I met him for the first time when his owner was standing out in the parking lot. And I just had a sense based on, in part, my own racial and class biases, because this was a young Latino man out there with a pit bull with a big pinched collar around his neck. I thought, oh, shoot, you know, the only reason this guy is here is because he's trying to dump the dog. So I went out and I talked to him, which is something volunteers did do sometimes, kind of trying to redirect people. And he was a very nice young man. And we talked at some length about his living situation and why it was that Fats was coming into the shelter. And I went through what I would, you know, call imagination acrobatics, trying to come up with solutions to his problem, which was really just foundationally a housing issue, which is why so many of the dogs come into the shelter. But every suggestion that I had, this young man just said, no, can't do that. No, you know, I suggested, and volunteers did do this quite a bit as well. We have a number of more affluent communities very close by, and people can drive to those and surrender a dog that belongs to them, but say it's a stray that they found in that community service area. And then that dog ends up in a low kill, high service shelter instead of in a high kill, low service shelter like PAW. So I suggested that, can you take him here? Can you take him there? Can I take him there for you? Absolutely no, 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 no to everything. And so Fats went into the shelter. I knew as a middle-aged pit bull who was not house trained, who was not socialized, you know, that his chances of getting out of the shelter were very low. And indeed he was dead, you know, within a couple of days after his impound. Owner surrenders can be killed 36 hours after their owners leave them at the shelter. And the young man had given me his email address, you know, and I can say honestly, like, it was really hard for me not to send him an angry rant after that, you know, after Fats was killed, just telling him off about what he had done to his dog, and how his dog didn't deserve that. And so those, you know, those feelings absolutely are there, and they're there for all of us who are in that shelter environment. But a lot of the, you know, sort of misanthropic feelings also weren't about guardians again, but they were about the shelter itself, particularly the shelter managers. You know, they treated volunteers very poorly. They generally rendered us very powerless to affect change. They made volunteers feel useless because every suggestion that we had or every program we offered to initiate on our own, the shelter managers would say couldn't be done for one of any number of seeming excuses that they would, you know, come up with. They never took accountability for when animals were killed by mistake. And that did happen several times, which I also, you know, recount a few examples of in the book. So that means animals who had an adopter coming or a rescue coming, and somebody in the process failed to look through the notes and read them properly and killed an animal who's supposed to get picked up that day. So they get put down always in the morning at the shelter. So, you know, and
that leads to the grief thing. You know, there
yeah.
you are, you know, like Katie going to these awful auctions, and there's so much feeling that even if you intellectually understand why those feelings exist, and help to understand them, isn't there's something still wrenching about having created a study that methodologically required you to go through these experiences.
Yeah, and that was absolutely the hardest part of doing this research, was being in that environment. And the field work I delimited as 3 years. I actually volunteered there relatively intensively for 8 years. So it's a lot of time spent in an environment that was often really, really upsetting. And it's interesting too how the mind does what it does. I'm not a psychologist. But when I think about my work there, because I was very involved, particularly in helping the dogs who I saw as the biggest underdogs in the shelter environment, so pit bulls and mixed breed large dogs, I played a significant role, I would say, in probably saving close to 10,000 dogs myself. But when I think about like the dogs that I remember from the shelter, it's never those dogs. The ones who actually went on, to have happy lives as companions. I see a lot of them on social media, which I love. That's great. When I open my Instagram feed and a dog I helped get out of the shelter 5 years ago is, sitting at home with their new human baby or whatever. But the dogs that you always remember the most are the dogs that you didn't get out. And I think, that's a really difficult, difficult piece of the work for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Crystal is going to want me to wrap this up pretty quickly, but let me ask one last two-part question.
Yes.
Which probably will not seem to have any connection between the two parts, but at least you'll know what's coming.
Okay.
Could you discuss some of the issues of methodology for your project? Conceiving of how to do this, the structure you expected for yourself in doing this work, and the kind of contextualization you wanted for the project. And were there any surprises? And finally, as the final question to you, what are you working on now, or do you plan to work on, or are you in recovery?
Okay.
And I'll help you remember, but that's and then
Yeah.
I think Crystal will take over from us.
Okay. Terrific. Yeah, so in regards to the first question about sort of methodology and developing the methodology and the contextualization for the work, my entree into this field site was as a volunteer first. So I began volunteering at this shelter at a time when I was working on a completely different research project, and my personal dog died, and I ended up going to the shelter looking for a new dog, and that became sort of a gateway into volunteering there myself. And so I'd already been volunteering for about a year at the time that I started, where I decided that I was going to pursue it more intensively as a research site. And I think, having that time going in was really helpful for me, both analytically, but also personally, talking again about kind of these emotion issues. I'd made one decision from the outset that I was not going to let my new or different role as a researcher change if and how I engaged in advocacy for the animals. During the entire time that I volunteered at PAW, from within a few months of starting until I left, I was somebody who, for a number of different reasons, was kind of a volunteer spokesperson, and other volunteers would turn to for help advocating for specific animals, but also for help advocating more broadly within the shelter system. So I met many times, for example, with the managers, not of PAW, but of the multi-shelter agency, of which PAW is just one part, which is something that, typical volunteers, weren't doing. And it was important to me not to say, well, now I'm a researcher, I can't, interfere with this environment. I knew that I had to keep doing what I was doing in terms of advocacy, or it wasn't going to be emotionally manageable for me, to continue there. And, and I think generally in terms of methodology, like most of my methodological issues were really ethical issues. As someone who is a feminist researcher, I generally embrace participatory methods in which, what you are researching and who you are researching is involved in different ways in helping develop research questions and developing information that's going to be useful for the community being researched. But for a lot of different reasons, I didn't think that that was going to be possible at PAW. And so that was for me, you know, one of the unfortunate realities that I think most ethnographers working in any kind of repressive institution, whether it's, you know, some kind of police agency or corporations or prisons or animal shelters, you know, encounter, but you end up kind of letting go of some of your ideals in regards to method. The other challenge, you did ask about challenges, right? I know I'm short on time, but the other challenge that was interesting for me was conducting ethnography of animals, because there's very, very little work out there that models how you conduct ethnographic research when you're doing that work, you know, and focusing specifically on animals and trying to really incorporate animals into an analysis. And it was really important to me from the outset that animals be part of it, but you really have to set aside a lot of what you think you know, particularly about companion animals. You know, if it had been another type of animal about which I knew less, it might have actually been easier for me to do because I wouldn't have gone in with my own set of assumptions, like when a dog wags its tail, it's happy, or whatever, you know, kind of beliefs and knowledge that we all think we have about our so-called, you know, best friends. And they're just sort of very detailed questions of like, how do you even document what's significant about what an animal is doing? Is an animal gazing at something a significant thing to write down in your field notes? You know, what actions that you see dogs and cats taking are the ones that need to be commented on. And I think the existing scholarship on witnessing, and as you noted, Katie is here today, so she's written a great deal about that, including in her brilliant book, The Cow with Ear Tag 1389. You know, the witnessing scholarship was really, really helpful for me to think about how to be deliberately present with an animal and to try to understand the world from an animal's perspective, and to really bridge the individual with the structural, to move beyond witnessing, you know, to also see how that witnessing for me had to be part of a broader political project to try to change the conditions, you know, for the animals who I was observing at the shelter. Was there a third piece? I'm sorry, Carol.
Yeah, it's the final. Sorry, yeah, I threw a lot at you, sorry.
No.
And, you know, I just want to say, I think this whole thing, the work that you all are doing around this ethnography of animals and being aware of or recognizing the subjectivity of the other animals is just so exciting, and just sort of path breaking and opening up all these new ways of thinking about animals. But I was just trying to throw you a sort of low ball for the conclusion, but also because I'm interested, and I suspect other people are. Have you started working on something new? Do you have a plan to work on something new? Or as I was joking, you know, are you in recovery from this very challenging project and then writing about it?
Yeah, right now there's no recovery. I'd love to take a break, but it's not foreseeable at this juncture. But I also don't have a clear sense of like what the next book project is going to be, and I'm happy with that. When I wrote my first book and it was done, you know, it was also a year and a half before I really had a lot of clarity about what the next book project would be. And for me, especially when you're doing ethnography and it's really long-term intensive research, you have to be invested and really love what you're doing, or it's going to end up, you know, being kind of a personal hell for you to get through that experience. So I like having the time, you know, to be able to reorient and think about what might be next. From this project, I have a lot of information that I haven't used. And so I'm already been working on a number of papers from data that wasn't mobilized as part of the book. The book, for example, draws entirely on ethnography, but I actually did interviews with a number of different people in kind of different positions vis-a-vis the shelter. And I have one set of interviews that I think is probably the next paper that I'm going to be writing, that focuses on people who adopted animals out of animal shelters and the narratives that they create about the histories of those animals once they're in their homes with these new people. And I noticed even from just sort of preliminary analysis of those interviews that this seems to also be a highly gendered form of labor, as so much of the labor that goes into care work is, where women are the ones who spend time sort of thinking about and trying to understand their companion animals' current behavior based on a perceived, or in some cases invented, some cases documented, it varies, history of where that animal came from. I just submitted a paper for peer review that looks at how shelter volunteers and animal rescuers who assist dogs coming out of paw resist the devaluation of the lives specifically of disabled dogs, while also sensationalizing and fetishizing disability through their various discursive and representational practices. So kind of reflecting on dominant discourses of femininity and also family. These rescuers tend to position themselves as sort of super moms to disabled dogs, who in turn are also then created as super crips, and really mobilize a whole set of gendered meanings centered on family in their strategies to try to find homes for dogs that most people consider to have no value as companion animals because of the specific physical or behavioral disabilities that they have. I've also been getting a lot of pressure. I don't know what it will, result in, but a lot of people really want me to write more about, it's funny how well you can know a book, but you don't know your chapters. I'm just actually looking in the book here. I'm like, what is this? To the chapter on animals' resistance to shelter rule. Yeah. That chapter has really incredibly resonated with people, which I'm so happy about, because for me, that felt in a lot of ways like the chapter where I was most going out on a limb. But especially within the sheltering community and even outside of it, a number of people have already said to me, you need to just keep working on chapter 7 and make that a book, because that should be a book in and of itself. And there is a lot of really great work out there already on animal resistance. But as I'm starting to think more about it, I think part of why this resonates so deeply is specifically because it's animal resistance in the context of companion animals. And it's always my hope in working on companion animals that, and I know this is not a given by any stretch, but that if we could get some things right as humans in our relationships with companion animals, that should augur well for our ability to get things right with other animals. So I am thinking about, some different possibilities there, including, for example, a critical feminist rereading of contemporary ideas about dog training and dog behavior, also a very masculinist line of work and occupation, to bring back animal resistance and animal agency and how we think about our human relationships, with animals who live so closely to us.
Well, we're all going to wait. Well, we won't hold our breath because it takes a while to do it, but all of those sound like wonderful projects. And thank you so much, Katja, for letting me be your interlocutor. And I think we'll let Crystal return to controlling the verbal space.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Carol, for these questions. It's really great to be able to talk about the book with you.
It's such a powerful book, and it's accomplishing so much on so many levels that it's really just an honor to be a small part of celebrating the appearance of your book.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. Those were such thoughtful and intentional questions. And Katja, just for sharing insights about the book, but also the research process. So for those of you who just joined on, I just cut and paste the note that I wrote to everyone during the conversation. If you haven't had a chance to purchase Professor Guenther's book yet, it is available online through Stanford University Press, and you can receive a 20% discount. I've included the discount code for you here. Again, this is sort of a creative rendering, I think, in some ways of a book talk, but it's also an opportunity for all of us to be in deep conversation engagement with just wonderful faculty members here at UCR who are writing such timely and important books. So with that said, I want to segue into some questions that I know have emerged. So I guess the first question, Katja, and again, for participants, if you want to ask a question, please just type it into the chat, and then we'll have a chance to ask that. So the first question is there a fear that once shelter in place ends, that shelter numbers will actually increase?
Yes, and I'm just looked into the chat for the first time as well, and I see that's coming from one of the students who took feminist animal studies with me. I think the first time it was offered by me at UCR. So hi, Cheyenne. um, yeah, there are definitely concerns about, you know, that there's going to be a wave of animal returns once the epidemic ends. But I think that people are feeling more encouraged as a lot of the lockdown did start to lift, you know, in different states, as we know, at different rates and paces. I mean, there's some parts of the country that are operating almost as normal right now compared to, you know, how things are currently in California. And that, you know, as workplaces were reopening, there hasn't actually been evidence that people who adopted animals at the beginning of COVID are bringing them back. And I think part of that is just most people, if they kind of make that commitment and they have that animal in their life, they're able to find ways to negotiate keeping that animal there, even if it means now I have to pay for doggy daycare or, you know, a dog walker, or my dog has to be at home longer, or I have to come home at lunch, or whatever, you know, might be. That's particularly for dogs, because they're a little bit more labor intensive as companion animals than cats. So far it looks promising. I think the bigger issue is we're going to see so many more people falling into economic struggle than we already had. We know that in the Great Recession, 2007 through 2009, that the number of animals in US shelters skyrocketed. So I don't think that it'll be shelter in place ending that will be the catalyst for seeing increases in shelters. It'll be increases in poverty.
And then Jerry O'Donnell noted in the chats that you know, I'm hearing from numerous rescues that the wave of animal abandoning has begun. So another question that emerged for you, Katja, is if I understand it correctly, there's a broad range of negative feelings in the shelter. What about neutral or positive feelings? And more generally, what kind of place is the shelter in the quote unquote emotional landscape of modern cities or societies?
Yeah, there are absolutely neutral and positive feelings that take place in the shelter. And in one of the chapters of the book, I talk in some detail, particularly about the positive feelings associated with happy ending moments and how important those are for staff and for volunteers to be able to maintain any kind of sense of purpose and hope for the work that they're doing in the shelter. Particularly for dogs, we saw during the time that I was a volunteer at PAW, the live release rate increased pretty significantly. At the time that I started, about 45% of all dogs were killed at the shelter. By the time I finished my field work, that had dropped to about a third. So that's still a lot of dogs that, you know, 1 in 3 being killed, but it's far fewer than almost half. For cats, you know, the changes haven't been as positive, and it's still about 85% of cats at the shelter will die there. But these moments of getting animals out into homes, it's very ritualized. Volunteers or staff members take a so-called freedom photo of the animal who has just been adopted or rescued on the outside of the shelter walls. So still in front of the shelter, you know, with the kennel buildings and so forth visible, but they're on the outside now. And sometimes, you know, later people will take pictures and find ways to get them connected into social media worlds as well, with, you know, the dogs at home or the dogs eating a hamburger from the In-N-Out around the corner on the way home and things like that. But those moments really provide an immense amount of emotional relief, if you will, to the people who are involved in the shelter work, the staff and the volunteers. And then I think neutrality is actually, you know, a huge part. And pointing back to Katie Gillespie's book, because she's I think still here on the call as well, you know, and she talks about in the dairy industry just how mundane everything is. And a big part of an animal shelter is just mundane work. You're just spraying, you know, disinfectant into kennels, you're scraping it down, you're poop and scoop, you're hosing it out, you're putting collars with ID tags onto animals and putting them in cages, you're shooting vaccines into animals, you're shooting microchips into animals. You're busy, it's always busy, and like the environment is definitely fast paced, but it's sort of just a neutral state of like, this is what normal everyday moments, you know, are like in the shelter. So there's definitely, you know, a wide range emotions that are expressed, you know, as part of that emotional landscape. And I think people have very strong ideas before they even get to shelters, kind of what they'll encounter. And certainly I hear from a lot of people that they can't even go to a shelter like Paul because it's too upsetting to be there. So just thinking about your question, Annette, about the emotional landscape of the modern city, you know, I think that people have sort of their own sets of ideas in advance of visiting a shelter of what it's going to be like there. And for a lot of people, unfortunately, you know, ideally people would be going and adopting, people regard it as a site of kind of emotional fear because they're worried it's going to be upsetting or traumatizing to go.
So another question for you, Katja, is I'm curious about any research findings, particularly since you were a volunteer for so long, that surprised you.
Research findings that surprised me. Yeah, there are research findings that surprised me. I'm just trying to think about how to best word them. I think the research finding that most surprised me was how unable many people who advocate for animals are, or are not, I should say, they're not able to see connections between their work on behalf of animals and broader social inequalities in our society. So it's very baffling to me when you have the same person advocating against killing in animal shelters and referring to staff members at the shelter who are involved in that as murderers, you know, and those kinds of insults of the shelter staff, who at the same time, when they're outside of the shelter environment, are very purposeful advocates of the death penalty for humans, who are the people who are the first in line when there is, you know, Carol asked earlier about kind of animal abuse of companion animals and how that allows us to deflect attention away from the population of literally billions of animals versus a few million animals, you know, that's being abused every moment in this country in factory farming. But, you know, they're always the first ones to say that person, you know, dumped their dog in a park, you know, somebody, you know, should go and shoot that person. So just, you know, and a lot of these people also being vegan and pretty like heavily identified with the animal, you know, the animal liberation movement. And it may have been naive on my part to not expect more people like that and, you know, who have those kinds of worldviews. And I think what became apparent to me in doing the research is really the ways in which we can use our relationships with companion animals to kind of make ourselves feel better about the ways in which we neglect and abuse farmed animals. Similarly, for people who are adopting pit bulls, you know, it's my interpretation of sort of the increased popularity of pit bulls, specifically in upper and middle class white homes, that is kind of a low stakes, low investment way for whites and other non-disadvantaged people of color to demonstrate their racial and class flexibility and their open-mindedness, when those same whites and advantaged people of color would likely strenuously object, and sometimes I've seen them do so, you know, to higher stakes, higher investment ways to challenge white supremacy, like sending their kids to underperforming public schools, or actually actively promoting the construction of low-income housing in their own communities. So I think that there's this hope among a lot of animal abolitionists or people like me who oppose the use of any human use of animals, that maybe this, you know, that people who are involved in animal rights will be able to extend their comprehension of animal rights to other animals, including human animals. But so far I haven't really seen that happen. I guess that was sort of a disappointing surprise. And it also runs in the opposite direction in looking at the literature. And this is more of like a literature finding than a direct research finding in terms of my ethnography, but studies of prison abolition, theorizing of carceral studies, feminist studies, you know, animals are still so far on the sidelines. And it's really unfortunate to not see people making what to me seem like very clear connections. We're not going to be able to get rid of cages and prisons for people if we're still caging and imprisoning billions of animals in this country. we're not going to achieve equal rights for women and for Blacks and for other groups who have always been disabled, who've always been constructed as being more animal-like than human, if we don't do away with this idea that there's a division between the human and the animal. So there's a lot of work to be done. Sorry, that was probably a bigger answer than needed for that question, but lots of surprises analytically.
Okay, so there's a handful of more questions for you, Katja. So the
Sure.
next question, I think, is a clarification question. So the 45% when you entered, going down to 1/3 being killed, are you talking about the quote unquote usual shelter, quote unquote live release numbers, or the total number killed, both adoptable and unadaptable?
Yeah, so Jerry has some insider knowledge of how data manipulation happens in the shelter system. And unfortunately, in spite of my very best efforts to obtain raw data from PAW and also from SCAS, or Southern California Animal Services, which is the name that I give the broader shelter system to which PAW belonged, it was impossible to do. And technically, under Freedom of Information Act laws, anybody can make a request from a public agency to ask for particular kinds of information. But if they consider your request too broad, like, may I have the impound records and notes of every animal impounded for the month of February in 2015, they'll say, no, we're not going to do that for you. So one of the challenges with data, and in talking in the last couple of weeks with a lot of representatives from the animal sheltering world, I'm now realizing how widespread this practice is. When animal shelters talk about their live release rates, they are generally only including the live release rate calculated out of a base of the animals they considered adoptable. So the animals who are considered unadoptable, that were considered too dangerous to place, maybe they allegedly bit somebody or even just barked at someone aggressively in a kennel, or who had some kind of a health issue, and often, again, those are very minor and treatable things like kennel cough. Those unadoptable animals basically disappear from the baseline. And so we'd get a very different number if we actually had the information on all animals at the shelter, as opposed to the outcomes only for those that were made available for adoption.
Okay. And then the next question is, you mentioned freedom photos. Could you talk a little bit more about the interesting use of language within shelters? Did anything stand out to you during your analysis regarding language?
Yeah, there is a lot of interesting use of language. Freedom photos, as a concept, I think are hearkening back to all kinds of broader ideas of, freedom from prison in general. Also, one often hears volunteers in particular, not so much staff, but volunteers at the shelter, talk about the shelter system in different kinds of carceral terms. So people would compare it to or describe it as being a slaughterhouse. Very common for me to hear volunteers talking about it as a concentration camp. So seeing it as a place where, a targeted population of animals was being held against their will and then being in, large numbers killed. And then people talking about it also as a prison. And then the most optimistic kind of language for talking about the shelter, which did come from the staff, was talking about it as sort of a homeless shelter. So a place where, temporary bedding and food was being offered in the hopes of helping these animals rather than people, get up onto their feet again. And even just, I think these different frames, sometimes the way they were used by volunteers were, I found problematic. I don't think talking about an animal shelter is analogous to concentration camps is appropriate. I'm also German American, and in Germany, we have a very different understanding of the legacy of Nazism than I think typical Americans do, and we're educated in a different way about it as well. But to just compare any carceral institution to a concentration camp is not something that analytically or personally sits well with me. But I think these debates, raises sort of interesting questions about how are we conceptualizing the shelter, and it's something I talk about in some detail in the book. That it's an institution that's really engaged in kind of competing missions of trying to help help animals, also police animals and police people, and also kill animals. And so understandably, there's going to be a lot of different language used from different perspectives.
And let's see, another question that emerged, which is a really great question, is, so Katja, based on your experience and research, if there were 3 things you could do to help dismantle the systemic white supremacist aspects of shelters, what would you suggest? Thinking especially as you enter into conversations with shelters who are attracted to your book, what would be your counsel for first steps?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I think in the book, I lay out probably more than 3 steps. I've never thought about this in terms of like prioritizing them, which I think, you know, this question is suggesting. This is a tough one. So I think it probably, you know, realistically, and I know you understand that as well, involves more than 3 things. I think one critical step is this move towards deinstitutionalization of shelter animals. Again, I don't think we can move away from our current white supremacist carceral state as long as we have other beings also confined in cages against their will. So that is one important, you know, initial direction, but it's also the one that I expect is going to be the slowest in coming, you know, realistically. And it's unfortunate, but I can say about the sheltering industry that in general, not everyone, of course, but there's a general lack of imagination in the sheltering industry. It's an industry in which people are very embedded in the practices that they've been doing for decades, and where it's very difficult to affect, you know, substantial change because so many of the leaders within the sheltering industry don't want to change things. They're very happy with the status quo. But deinstitutionalization would be one thing. Another thing that I suggest in the book that I think would be really important and helpful would be to develop better systems of community accountability. We're hearing about this too in regards to police brutality in the United States, the importance of having some kind of community oversight boards that exist and that actually have meaningful opportunities for regulating the agencies that they're overseeing, i.e. that they can't just, you know, write reports that nobody reads and nobody cares about, that they actually have some kind of tooth, right, in there. Use an animal reference, biting power. So I think it would be really important for a shelter like PAW or any shelter to have a community oversight board that really recognizes the diversity of the community that is being served, and that also includes representatives of animals, not just of people. And Eva Meyer has written some really interesting work on expanding the idea of democratic institutions to include animal voices. But I think that part of kind of destabilizing in general our ideas of power that also are what helps maintain white supremacy, you know, would be an important step in that regard as well. And then I think, because I think you'd asked for 3 and that was only 2. Number 3, there's so many different things that I could list that might be important as the third, but I think, you know, just some in nutshells, some things that would be really helpful would just be a general restructuring of shelters in general, particularly changing who actual staff members are and creating opportunities for staff to learn more about the communities that they serve from a less hostile and supremacist kind of point of view. And it's important to note that most of the staff who are doing this policing work in these low-income communities, they are members of those communities in terms of their racial ethnic backgrounds. But they have created, you know, different mechanisms for seeing themselves as different, primarily because of upward class mobility, but also through this discourse of irresponsible owners. And so I think even just challenging and sharing what's problematic about this whole idea of irresponsible owners is something that in a lot of ways destabilizes a white supremacist practice that's used to justify surveilling and policing low-income communities in lots of ways, but including in their relationships with their companion animals.
Great, thank you, Katja. So one last question for you that I can see. So how would you, and you spoke a little bit about this during your talk, but can you talk a little bit about how you connect feminism and animal studies through this particular book?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I'm explicitly approaching animal studies from a feminist perspective. And there are a lot of different ways in which that kind of played out and how I conceptualized the research that I was doing and also how I wrote about it. For me, feminism is a social movement and an intellectual project committed to ending sexism and misogyny and oppression and gender oppression and all of its various manifestations, but in which intersectionality or the interconnections between different forms of inequalities are also extremely important. And one of the things that I think is particularly powerful about feminist perspectives is the way in which they don't let power off the hook. And so for me, that was sort of a guiding principle of conducting this research, was really attending to different kinds of relationships of power in what I was observing on the ground at PAW and bringing it to light, making it visible, which is such a core practice of feminist methods. The shelter environment itself also is a highly gendered space. I didn't talk about it in a lot of detail in our conversation today, but I did mention at least a bit that the people who volunteer at the shelter overwhelmingly are women. In the time that I was a volunteer there, I know of 4 men who were regular volunteers, and I know of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of women. So it's not even just like a slight gender imbalance, it's a massive, massive gender skew. When we look at the staff, that gender disparity isn't as readily apparent. There were, during the time I was there, managers who were men, upper level managers who were men, and upper level managers who were women. But there were ways in which their authority was routinely challenged, in part based on gender stereotypes. And also for the work of the lower level kennel attendants, the people who are engaged in kind of the mundane care of the animals, there were also noticeable divisions of labor based on gender. So it was really important to me to also conceptualize and analyze the environment of PAW as being very much a gendered environment, and where ideas about gender and also how gender intersects with race was so significant in shaping some of the discourses, like the discourse of irresponsible owners, because irresponsible owners in sort of the ideal type model are specifically low-income people of color who are men. Women are much less likely to be identified or sort of pilloried as irresponsible owners. It's overwhelmingly men, specifically Black and Latinx men, and to somewhat lesser degree, but still pretty commonly in this particular shelter environment, also newer immigrant Asian men, Asian American men. So there's sort of an understanding or belief that men can't be the right kind of caregiver to animals. And it's obviously embedded in deeper social beliefs that we have about who gives care and who is compassionate in our society. And this idea that men simply can't provide compassion and care in the same way that women can, particularly to vulnerable populations like shelter animals. So those are just some of the connections that I see. There's a lot.
Thank you
I
so
keep
much,
seeing new
Katja.
messages pop up, and I don't know if questions or if they're comments, so I don't want to answer any one question too long and run out of being able to answer as many as possible.
So I think just because of time, Tammy, you asked such an amazing question. So we did actually jot down the question. We can send it over to Katja, and maybe we could talk about it also during a department meeting or something like that. But we want to just be sensitive to time, but so thankful for the wonderful conversation that was had and really the incredible questions that were asked as well. So I just wanted to, before we end this event, I just wanted to do one last plug for the book Salon series that is being co-hosted and facilitated by the Department of Gender Sexuality Studies as well as CIS. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. So let me know. Katja, can you see that?
Oh yes, why I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I just want to share, this is again part of a book salon series, and again, so much gratitude to Professor Guenther and Carol for this wonderful dialogue and really celebrating the publication of the lives and death of sheltered animals. So we have 2 more book events that are coming up in November. Post-elections, we'll have The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, where Professor Jane Ward will be joined by Professor Angela Jones. And then later in January, celebrating the new year, we'll have Professor Brandon Andrew Robinson in conversation with Professor Terrell Winder from UC Santa Barbara. And again, this is really a great opportunity for all of you to participate in these talks and to also purchase these wonderful books, to be in conversation with our authors. So let me stop that. So any last words from Carol or from Katja?
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Katja, for this amazing presentation, and congratulations on your book. Carol, thank you so much for joining us, and Crystal for putting together this amazing event. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Thank you. This is our department chair, Professor.
Just as a hippie.
Thank you, Shireen. I know you're a big dog lover, so I hope this resonated with you. For a change of pace, we didn't hear her barking today.
No. She didn't bark, but I put it on mute. Just
Any last words, Carol or Katja? Or?
I was just trying to type before the chat goes away to say that I'm happy to talk to about the racism in the animal rights movement. You know, I'll just quickly put in, I was interviewed by the Berkeley side, which is, sorry, that's the dogs eating in the background. I was interviewed by Berkeley side because there's an animal rights activist running for mayor who I happen to not agree with about a lot of things. And the reporter called and she said, "Oh, Berkeley, yeah, Berkeley, we've banned fur and we've banned dog meat." I said, "What, you know, what good is that? I mean, this is what Berkeley's proud of, banning dog meat? Like, you had a big problem there?" It's such an easy sell that capitulates to racism. But I know that's a whole nother topic, and that's not what we're here to discuss, but I'm happy to email with people about what we're trying to do in terms of educating how that's white supremacist.
Yeah.
But I love this book. I'm so honored to be a part, Katja, of supporting your book. I think this way of responding to COVID by your department is wonderful. I hope other schools do this, and I think it's given us a chance to be in dialogue across, you know, miles. So thank you, Crystal, for all the work it took to make sure we were all
it's my honor,
on top of the job.
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And I just I'll piggyback for just 30 seconds on Carol's point, and I can't answer Tammy's complex question here. But one of the things I also hear from people is like, okay, so you're arguing that, you know, that animal shelters interrupt relationships between animals and their human guardians, and that is done in a way that particularly targets low-income, non-white people. But who cares? Why does it matter? And so just thinking about what Carol was just commenting on about what we're kind of focused on and legislating, like Berkeley doing dog meat, which doesn't seem, you know, it's not a problem, but the problem for animal shelters is the work that they're engaging in is the work of soul killing. And that, you know, is such a critical part of white supremacy, coercing someone to give up their animals, or legally using the legal system to force them to, or preventing them from being able to reclaim an animal that they've lost. It's always a reminder of the authority of the state to surveil and to police and to disrupt. And it's an interaction in which a guardian is always positioned as being other and as doing wrong and as being wrong. And it creates a rupture in human-animal bonds that, in my observations, consistently were really important to both parties, to the animal, you know, and to the person. I think it's something that, from my data, I also need to write about more, is why it matters to people to lose their animals. Because I think we understand why it matters to people if people are shot by the police or people end up in jail, but there's all these different manifestations, from education systems to animal control, of white supremacy. And we also need to do, and I need to do, a better job of articulating, you know, why that matters. And I think this aspect of really, you know, soul killing is critical.
Wonderful.
So that's not a very uplifting final note, sorry. We're talking about killing animals, now we're killing souls. But but you know,
beginning of a larger conversation.
yeah,
for sure.
exactly. But yes, thank you all for being here. It's great to have so much support in the department, and thank you, Crystal, for all this work that you've been doing for this series.
Well, thank you everyone again, and I hope all of you are well, and we'll be in conversation hopefully sooner than later.
Terrific. Thanks, Carol. Thank you,
everyone.
Crystal. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.